Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Welcome back, everyone, to the very latest Fly Culture Podcast. I'm going to start things with a word of thanks for all the kind comments via email and social media for the last podcast that I did with Felce Sharkey. And interestingly, while I was setting up to record this one, I got an email in from somebody in Australia, actually, Ben, which sums up perfectly what we were trying to get across and convey within that podcast. And I'm going to read that now. Hi, Pete. Wow. I've received my first copy of Fly Culture magazine, and I've given it a couple of weeks to really let those wonderful stories sink in. Thank you, Ben, very much indeed. I must say that I'm glad I subscribed sight unseen. The content does not disappoint. With so much North American fly fishing content out there, being able to read a quality UK-based magazine has been enlightening. On that note, the recent podcast where you interviewed Felce Sharkey was one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. In Australia, I think we ignorantly believe that the revered English chalk streams, although having been somewhat gentrified over the centuries, are still the pristine watercourses they have always been. I was horrified to learn of the debilitating draining and polluting issues these streams are facing. What a wonderful and very well-informed advocate for these streams is Felce. Of course, the waste products of a large population must go somewhere. However, there must be hundreds of better solutions than to dump raw sewage into these streams, if indeed they are still flowing after the water companies have taken their share. Such gross mismanagement is appalling. Thank you for bringing these issues to light and for allowing guests to say what needs to be said. Thank you, Felce, for fighting for better water resources for decades, realising that outcomes aren't what you expected and looking outside of the box for different strategies to provide different outcomes. Outstanding. Sincerely, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for that and the kind words about fly culture as well. And that wasn't just the only message we'd got. And I'm really, really pleased that this has got across to people. I know there's lots of people who are aware of what's going on with the water companies, but it was certainly a really emotive subject. And I'm pleased it did strike a chord with so many people. We're lucky to have people like Felce who stand up and question what is happening and do something about it. And I hope it acts as inspiration to others to help fight the disgraceful behaviour of the water companies. And since this has actually happened, I've been been doing a bit of digging around and thinking, right, what can we do? And I've tried my best to retweet, share stuff, put it on fishing forums and let people know what's going on out there. And like I say, I know many of us do, but there's still lots of people. And I hope in some small way this helps get people together. And I've been looking on places like the social media, Instagram, Twitter. The water companies all have Instagram pages. They say that the service departments and don't look at them, but I wonder if we do start hitting those a little bit more in a concerted effort. And I also looked, and I know Felce brings up about the management of the Environment Agency and how they're not fulfilling their roles. And I looked up Sir James Bevan, who's the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency, and I found he's actually on Twitter. His handle, just in case you might be interested in it, is @JamesBevanEA. His surname is spelt Bevan, just in case you might be interested. But, perhaps if we are continually seeing these things, that we make ourselves in a greater group, just keep hitting these people and let them know. So Felce, thank you so much. I know he subscribes to this podcast, so I know he'll be listening, and I'd like to say thank you to him on my behalf, but also on behalf of so many messages I got from people as well. Also, thanks for the messages I got for the previous podcast before that with Steve Cullen as well. I know that was really well received. It was great to catch up with him. So thank you for that as well. And as you know, I always make sure I reply to every message, and I really, really do appreciate it. But this one, I hope we can help in a small way build some momentum with it. So on to today's podcast. I'm really pleased to be joined by Dave Felce. He's also known as Corsican Dave. He's an all-round fly angler, probably best known for chasing carp and barbel on the fly. Today, I hope to learn about his fly fishing career and a bit more about setting up for these species. And also, I'm really, really pleased that he's a contributor to Fly Culture. I think he's written 3 articles for us now, and he captures exactly what our magazine is about in there. There's been some great pieces that he's written, and he's a really important part of the Fly Culture family as well. So, Dave, it's great to have you here. How's it going?
It's great to be here, Pete, and thanks very much for those really kind words. It's an honour and a privilege to be chatting to you today. Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks very much.
Good.
Sun's coming out.
Fishing?
Sorry.
Are you getting out fishing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So during the last week, I've been out for pike a couple of times on one of my local venues. The weather's actually been quite good for that. Things are nice. I'm getting out fishing a little bit more at present, of course, because we're furloughed. And so I'm sort of in and out of my day job, so to speak. Actually, at least as busy as I would be normally, but on the fishing side.
Good. And are the pike biting?
Yeah. I've not had any monsters, not in the last week or so, but yeah, they're keen. And I've got the knack. I mean, I've been fly fishing for pike for now, crikey, must be the best part of 15 years. And it's a case of, as with any fish, it's knowing how they work, really, and how you work with them, looking at the likely spots, working out how you're going to get a fly into that and what you want that fly to do. So I'm reasonably successful at that. Yeah.
Good. And that's hopefully we're really keen to pick your brains, particularly on the carp side of things. And the timing seems to be pretty good for it. I've stopped just in the very short term fishing for trout at the moment because I think, in my opinion, the water's a little bit too warm, so I'm going to leave them alone for a bit. And this is where these other species come out, whether people are heading to the coasts, whether they're chasing pike or carp or other species. So it's kind of interesting. So I'm fascinated to learn a little bit more, and particularly with the way that you go chasing these fish as well, which I think is a little bit different and really, really interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. But where did the journey start for you? Where were you growing up, and when did fishing come into your life?
Right, so I come from the fishing hotbed of Milton Keynes. It's certainly not a fly fishing hotbed, or wasn't when we were kids. We didn't know anybody who went fly fishing. Trout fisheries were only just starting to get going at that point. So my background was, I've always been interested in nature. What started that? Probably my dad, who's into his bird watching and that sort of thing. But also we had a garden pond, and that was an endless source of fascination for me. We had newts in there. And so, funnily enough, reptiles and amphibians is one of my specialist subjects. And I went on from there to looking at fish. And it was just this sort of desire to be part of their world in some respect, not necessarily to catch them, but to watch them and to see what they do. And of course, because they're underwater, and sometimes, quite often, in fact, of course, hidden, it's how do you get in contact with them? And fishing seemed to be the natural approach. So I pestered my parents, and they sort of said, well, it's not really our thing. But eventually, what really did it for me was an aunt took me fishing with my uncle's fishing gear, an old cane rod with a dodgy wood tip, and we fished over my grandfather's back fence, which happened to back onto the Grand Union Canal. Can't remember what I caught. I know I caught something. It would have been a perch or a roach, the same as everybody else, on bread paste. That was it. I was hooked from then on. You just couldn't stop me, really. And combine that with the interest in natural history, watching Cousteau on the telly, David Attenborough, reading about his Zoo Quest journeys, Gerald Durrell, and we'll probably return to that a bit later because that sparked off a couple of ideas as well. But big influences like that.
It's fascinating you talk about the connection with the fish, and I'm not catching many at the moment, but when I catch a salmon, and I'm lucky enough to catch salmon, just as I'm about to release it, there feels as though there is a connection, brief though it is, between me and the fish. And it transcends, to me at least anyway, a level. It does feel as though for that brief moment you have that connection with that fish before it goes on its journey. And it still continues to blow my mind that, that's a fish that's traveled so far and found its way home again. It just extraordinary. But I get what you mean about that connection with fish.
Yeah, I think if you come back to handling fish, for instance, now, there's all sorts of moral arguments about whether we should be catching fish at all, and whether fish feel pain and all that sort of stuff. But it's really quite interesting, particularly handling, let's say, the big carp. They struggle. Of course they do. You're not bringing them in completely tired out. It's not good for the fish. But there certainly becomes a point, as you say, about the release time or even before, where you sense that the fish is basically maybe thinking, who knows what they're thinking, but they appear to relax a wee bit. And it's almost as if, oh, I'm not in danger. And for me, that's quite a nice feeling, but particularly you watch that fish go away, you put the fish back into the water, and you've intruded in its life a little bit, but you've learned something, you've derived some pleasure from it, and hopefully we can pass that on to other people as well, just how much fun it is and how much you can learn about these creatures by the pursuit of angling for them, even if you don't necessarily catch them. Once again, that's something we'll get onto later on, this whole concept of watching fish. Seeing what they do, trying to get to a certain extent inside their psyche, which hopefully makes us better fishermen.
Yes, absolutely. We've got a tiny little pond in our back garden. It's tiny, ornamental type thing, and we have some fish in there, and we got raided by herons, but we've got some small mirrors in there, and watching them is just fantastic. That we feed them. We have a coffee about 10:30 every day, and Emma and I go out and feed them and watching them. And it's amazing how often they miss the food, how often they don't actually connect with it in the same way. And it's very interesting that we often blame ourselves for a fish not eating, yet sometimes they miss it. And I think when they're feeding at the surface as well, that their vision when they're right up underneath it, I don't know if it is, how that affects things as well. But it's really, really interesting to see that. And I've learned a lot just sitting watching, as you say, watching fish. And I guess I'm similar to you, that I'm perfectly happy just watching fish. And I was recently up on the chalk streams and went into Stockbridge, and I had a coffee. I was way too early. I was fishing with Brett, and I was way too early. And there was a fish hidden. It was a great big rainbow trout, but it was fascinating that people were coming feeding some of the small little wild fish that were there, which I love. But it was fascinating seeing this guy was hidden away under a walkway. And I was thinking to myself, unless you were a fisherman, you wouldn't have known that fish was there. And it must have been 6 or 7 pounds. It was a great big old thing with a big kite, and was a great big old fish. But it was fascinating watching him. And yeah, as an angler, seeing him, that people who didn't angle probably didn't see that. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It sure is, yes. It's the fact that fishermen, and particularly fly fishermen, I think, although some people might shoot me down with this, seem to be naturalists. And in many ways, we're not just fishing. We're observing those fish, and we're also observing the environment around it. And we are quite often, it comes back to you, to the comments about the Fergal Sharkey podcast. We are quite often the first line of defense if there's anything untoward happening in the environment. So I think we play quite an important role there, not just as well in protecting the environment, but communicating that back to other people who don't fish and maybe aren't quite as familiar with that aquatic environment as us.
Yeah, good points. So take me, I know the answer to this because, and I'm sure if people have read Fly Culture, they'll know the answer to this as well. But when your fishing career was getting going, there was that moment when you thought, yes, this is for me. Did you have a mentor?
I didn't as such. I think a key person, certainly as far as the fly fishing was concerned, was a guy called Peter Smith, who was actually the subject of my of the last article. He gave me a fly rod very early on. I think I must have been about 9 or 10. And to be brutally frank, I didn't really know what to do with it. I knew what fly fishing was from reading and so on. But I promptly attached my trusty black print spinning reel, went down to the Grand Union Canal with a float rig and wondered why it didn't cast very well. But Peter knew what he was doing. He obviously realized that there was a spark fishing wise, and I think he was just trying to broaden my knowledge a wee bit. And something else that he instilled was the idea, which remained forgotten for a very long time, that fly fishing could be used for species other than trout and salmon. He happened to mention he'd caught accidentally quite a large pike fly fishing, and that must have lodged somewhere deep in the psyche and re-emerged later. My main inspiration really was TV but particularly books. I'm a very avid reader. At the time, of course, there was no internet. So all the research that you did had to be either word of mouth or, as we did as kids, we just absolutely destroyed the local library. I mean, and I've still got some of those books from back then. I bought some quite advanced books when I was a kid, So Fred J. Taylor's books were a great source of inspiration, particularly when I started specimen hunting for tench. BB, great stories. Obviously, Dick Walker. And then if we look at the TV side of things, then a great inspiration was a very off-the-wall program called The Fishing Race, where teams of people went out to try and catch as many species as possible. Something that stuck in my mind there was two guys managing to get themselves into a zoo aquarium, which completely skewed the results, and also stuck in my mind later, and John Wilson, moving forward, the Go Fishing series. We were in the Anglia television area, so we got the John Wilson programs as early as anybody else, and that was a bit of a revelation as well. So not individual people as such. I bounced an awful lot off of my best fishing buddy. We just bounced ideas off of each other, and encouraged each other to try different things all the time.
It's interesting you say about the John Wilson, that I remember that used to be on late on a Friday night, didn't it? Where I lived, it used to be on, late Friday night, and I'd watch that. And it's been fantastic that the Paul Whitehouse and Bob Mortimer programs got yet another series as well. And having that on prime television, and again, I watched closely the feedback from the non-angling fraternity, and it was just so positively received. And I know it's not really just about fishing, it's about them exploring life, really, and perhaps the meaning and the fragility of life. But I think that's absolutely fantastic news. And also what you talk about, the library, is interesting to me. And certainly two guests I've had on here that I can think of off the top of my head, Charles Jardine and Pete Cockwell, their books played a big part in my development as a fly angler. And it seems as though things could be or might be a little bit different now, that you don't need to have to write a book. These guys, went out, and the people you mentioned went out and spent hours and hours on the water, learning their craft, learning about the behavior of the fish. And it seems as though things are slightly different now. Perhaps I'm just a dinosaur about this, but it just seems to go on the amount of followers rather than, you could be perceived as not such an expert, but if you've got lots of followers, perhaps you are perceived as that. How does that look to you?
I think we probably think the same on that, Pete, to be honest. I've got a big collection of angling books, and they are a constant source of pleasure and inspiration to me. And I think it's a little bit easy, or it seemed to me that it's a little bit easier to tap into a book, and you've got it in front of you, and you can go backwards and forwards and reread bits and so on. And yeah, you can watch a YouTube video and you can read track, but it's not quite the same. I think, there's a lot of really, really good stuff that's written. And as you've said, the people that have been out there and have compiled bits of writing like that, we know from our own experience, you spend an awful lot of time and effort doing it and trying to get it right. There's an awful lot of stuff, YouTube type stuff, that is quite momentarily inspirational with a bit of a wow factor, but actually the quality isn't there. You know, the advent of reasonably cheap video cameras has meant that everybody thinks they're Cecil B. DeMille, and frankly they're not. You know, it's just a shame. But on the other hand, it's inspiring people to get out there. So there's always a flip side to both these stories.
That's the really important point, isn't it? We want more people fishing. It appears there are more people wanting to take fishing up as well, which is fantastic news. And, you know, on one of the questions I was asked recently on one of the podcasts, you know, we want to bring everyone in no matter where they're from. So that's all good. So if those things are a vehicle for doing that, I'm all for that as well. So, you know, I guess it is, as you get older, it's, you look at what influenced you. And of course the influences change, don't they? And are more rapid and more wide as well. And, you know, I know fly fishing is seen as a cool sport, I hope, more so in the UK. And I think that is as a result of social media as well. But let's take you back to, you know, your career again. And you said that you were given the fly rod. When did the fly fishing really start to get going for you? And I thought it was fascinating that you mentioned that your friend sort of mentioned about catching a pike. And that obviously, as you say, was a point that stuck in your mind, in your psyche, that as you developed as a fly angler, you explored that more so than anything else, I guess.
Absolutely. I believe it or not, I actually really just gave up with a fly rod. One of my first trips as quite a young kid was out to Grafham Water with this old school, but as it was then, new school, glass fiber, heavy, soft Bruce and Walker. I couldn't get on with it, you know, and I pretty much said, well, it's not for me. Plus, at the time in my mind, I didn't have the venues because, of course, trout fishers were relatively expensive and there weren't that many of them. It didn't occur to you that you could maybe go down to the canal with a fly rod and target roach and chub and that sort of thing. So if we then go fast forward, I ended up with a very nice job with a multinational chemical company, and my location was in a laboratory complex in a village we actually had a stocked trout lake on site.
Wow.
It was, yeah, I know, amazing. And so I just used to wander down there at lunchtime and give it a bash, and I caught the odd fish, and it wasn't so bad. But one day I was aware of a couple of trades guys watching me on their lunch break, and I was feeling a bit self-conscious, as you do. And one of them wandered over and said, hey, mate, there's a fish over there. Look, over there. Can't you see it? I couldn't see this at all. And Andy, as I now know him, said, quick, give me your rod. Fired out this enormous amount of line. I'd never seen anything like it. It dropped absolutely plumb. The next thing, the line tightened up, the rod arced over, and he's into a fish. He handed me the rod and said, there you go, mate, it's your fish. Well, that was the start of a great friendship. Andy not only taught me how to cast, he was a very, very talented fly caster, but he also showed me how to look for signs of fish. And also another thing, despite the casting, something that really lodged away was he always used to say, there is no point casting for the horizon when the fish are at your feet. And that's always stuck with me, and that's a very, very good point that a lot of fly fishers should take note of. Everybody fixates on casting, and presentation is important, but do you know what? Distance, a lot of the time, it's fairly secondary. So fair play. Andy Izzard really started me on the journey there. So I'm good for him.
Yeah. And we were talking off mic, and the outdoors is incredibly important to you. And mountaineering came up, and it's interesting. It's such a cool, to me anyway, subject. I'd be absolutely useless at it. But there seems to be some sort of a theme here, because I'd love to say you're the first mountaineer we've had on here, but you're not. We've had Nick Yardley, who actually mountaineering took him from Yorkshire, I think it was, over to the United States, where he now lives. Dan Osman, who's been a guest, and they're both contributors as well to the magazine, is a keen mountaineer as well, and yourself as well. Do you think that sort of slots in with fishing and the need to be outside and in the environment, do you think?
I think it does. I think there's a huge amount of crossover, and I think an awful lot of of the listeners from out with the UK will at this point be going, "What are these guys talking about?" And particularly the guys from the States, because it really isn't an issue. It's very much part of the outdoors scene. That if you're into mountaineering, if you're into kayaking, canoeing, the chances are you've got a fishing rod with you, more often than not, possibly a fly fishing rod. So as I say, over there, it's not an issue, but there's definitely loads of crossover. And I don't have many regrets in my life, but possibly one would be the number of days I've spent in magical locations next to pristine water where I could see fish as a mountaineer, but I never put the two together. You just didn't. In the UK, there are two completely different subjects. Are you a fisherman or are you a mountaineer? And we are seeing that changing now. It's becoming cooler, funkier. We're beginning to see the sort of like the snow sports dudes and dudettes going, "Hey, wow, this is something I can do during the summer." It's great, and it's to be encouraged.
Yeah, absolutely. And that must have been torturous, being in those pristine environments, seeing fish and not having a rod. I don't know how I'd be able to cope with that, but I'd probably be a nervous wreck about having to climb up some mountain anyway. But do you think part of that, and we've touched on social media a little bit, and the influence, as you say, of the US comes across here about the great outdoors, and I think, to me, a lot of that is possibly led by companies like Patagonia and, their associations with mountaineering, their associations with fly fishing. And one of the things I've noticed in recent years in the UK as well, the amount of fly anglers wearing Patagonia caps, which has been really interesting to see that people, I wonder if that, as you say, that influence is coming from those sorts of places.
Absolutely. And in fact, my links with Patagonia go back a long, long way. So when I left university, I was working for one of our local outdoor shops in Milton Keynes, funny enough. And we were one of the first shops in the UK to stock Patagonia. Nobody had heard of it. Absolutely nobody had heard of it. And we were blown away by the colours and the quality. And also the Patagonia catalogue. Oh boy, those photos in there. And wow, there was fishing alongside mountaineering gear. And the guys were really wearing really cool, nice clothing. And it sowed that seed of, hey, wow, these aren't different subjects. It's just all part of the thing. And a good example of how staid and reserved in some respects the UK can be at times is our rep had a fly fishing vest from Patagonia. It was only a sample, and I took quite a shine to it. But it was a sample; he couldn't sell it to me. And then when he came back with the next season's exhibits, if you like, for ordering, he said, "Dave, that fly vest, would you like it?" Yes, of course I would. Why not? And the thing is, he hadn't been able to sell a single one to either outdoor shops or fishing shops. Why? Because the vest was grey and not green. Yeah, so we're talking early 80s here. And I think things have moved on an awful lot from there. Companies like Patagonia, led by fantastic guy, Von Schuenar, he's got credibility in the mountaineering world, the surfing world. It's a really big thing for him as well. And of course, fishing. And we've got the 1% for the planet sort of thing. And these are, it's basically saying we need to be aware of the environment. It's not just our playground. It's something that we need to look after and protect for other people. And we need to give something back. We need to be part of if you like, the replenishment and the safety of that environment that we're in, rather than just taking from it.
Absolutely. And that ties in with, the introduction in the previous podcast about the work that Fergal and others are doing as well. And, it's why I hope we become, as a group, even more vocal and take these things on a little bit more and take these companies to task a little bit more in perhaps different ways. So, I'm thinking about that a lot at the moment, and I'm sure if I can think of something smart enough that I will let people know about it on here, and if there is a way of doing it. But, it's interesting you say about the fly vests and stuff like that. And, I often talk about how fly fishing is actually perceived. And I bought one of those a little bit later, and it was the cream coloured one, because the one you had is the mesh one, isn't it, for warm conditions. And I managed to find one again. I bought it, I think it was in Farlow's actually, many, many, many years ago. And it was a short wading jacket. And most of them at the time were like what Roger Moore was wearing as James Bond in his sort of safari suit phase. And that was, to me, it was different. It was shorter and it made perfect sense. I'm sure there were others out there, but that was the first one that I was aware of. And that perhaps was, for me and for yourself, was the start of that process. And I know I'm heavily influenced by angling in the US and the perception of angling in the US comparable to here, say, for example, whereas our people, and as I've said before, people like J.R. Hartley and stuff like that, whereas they've got those guys with jeans, baseball cap and T-shirt, whatever. I've always been drawn more to that side of things, particularly with the writing of Girac and everything else as well. So that's where I've always tended to look for inspiration. But it's an interesting journey to go on there, and interesting to see how that is affecting other younger anglers who are able to spread fly fishing in a positive, cool way as well. I think it's really important for us, isn't it?
It sure is. As you say, this whole idea of the integration of the outdoors communities, including us, there's a couple of things that we can do to help ourselves here, and probably one of the main things is just to be a bit less tweedy and a bit cooler, whatever that might mean. Maybe a little bit more professional with regards to the outdoors. We like to think of ourselves as custodians of the environment, and a lot of us are. But unfortunately, there's still quite a few people leave litter around. And you see much more of that from the fishing community than you do from the other outdoors communities. It's sad to say it, but it's true. Things like improving your personal navigational skills, and your approach to the environment, and just little things like you never see a mountaineer drinking while they're climbing. We see an awful lot of drinking on duty as part of the fishing scene. I can't knock it if that's what people want to do, but it's that sort of perception of how we approach things. And the other thing is just to be chatty. There's a lot of negativity about kayakers, particularly. And I can understand exactly where that comes from. But crikey, stop and chat to these folk, and hopefully they'll stop and chat to you. And I think that works both ways. They need to understand that fishing folk are genuinely interested in the environment. They need to respect the fact that folks have possibly paid an awful lot of money to be allowed to fish, and that they are allowed to do it. That we're not into torturing fish for fun, which sadly seems to be a perception. And that fishing is a thing. It's not going to go away. And particularly we've seen that with kayak fishing, for instance. The paddle sports authorities used to have a program for an introduction to kayak fishing. It sort of slipped off the radar a bit, and I have no idea why that is. It's almost like, well, we don't really want to know about it. And there are a couple of things that kayak fishers, for argument's sake, do that don't square with safety in some respects from the paddle sports community. Anchoring is a very obvious one. You do not anchor kayaks. Well, the sad fact is, or the fact is, that you do anchor kayaks when you're fishing from them. So rather than saying we don't want it to happen, the paddle sports community needs to understand that it does happen. It is a requirement, and we need to find safe ways of working and teach people how to do it. So, as I say, a bit of give and take from both sides. But generally what we're seeing, certainly in the UK, is a greater move towards integration of the two groups and a greater understanding and trust and respect. And that's all for the positive, of course.
Yeah. Well, I hope that does get sorted at some stage. Now, before I start questioning you on targeting carp, in the introduction, I said you're also known as Corsican Dave. And I remember years back on some fishing forum seeing your name on there. So that obviously stuck with me. That was a long, long time ago now, I think. How does that name actually come about? Is there a story behind it?
There's no real story as such, Pete, but my family name, Felce, is relatively unusual. And we discovered, somebody else had done the research, another member of the family, that our family came from Corsica about 600 years ago, came over to the UK. There's a little village in the north centre of Corsica, up in the mountains there, with the family name. And as far as a moniker from the point of view of mountaineering and fishing was concerned, Corsican Dave kind of stuck. There are a lot of Daves out there. So quite aside from the surname, which some people have problems pronouncing, Corsican was a good one to pick on. So that was a nice, easy hit.
Great. And Corsica to Milton Keynes, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. Who'd have thought it? We've travelled a bit. So there's a bit of a theme there as well. So
let's get on to some of the meat of this interview about carp fishing. And I know you look at, and I'm trying to remember back to the first carp that I caught on a fly. I think it was in Cornwall. And it must be about 20 years ago, with a couple of friends of mine. Steve and a friend of his said, hey, do you want to come and catch carp on the fly? And, there was a little bit of it going on, but I didn't know so much about it. We sort of threw some biscuits out, got the fish rising and cast them, and I caught one, and that was cool. But I know you look at things in a slightly different way, and this is where it's really interesting for me as someone who likes to stalk fish as well, be it on the river or wherever that may be. You don't prefer to throw biscuits out or chum the fish up. And I want to learn a little bit about that. How did that process come about, and how did you get into carp on the fly?
Okay, so I quite aside from reading about it, I'd hooked up with a guy who went out fishing for barbel in central Spain quite a few years ago now. Prior to that, so Henry Gilby used to edit a fantastic magazine, Adventure Fishing. It was way ahead of its time, sadly. I mean, if it was on the shelves now, I'm sure it would fly off. But there was an article in there by John Bailey about fly fishing for barbel in Spain. That had stuck in my mind, and I thought, I quite fancy doing that. So when I got friendly with Colin, and he said, well, why don't you come out to Spain with me? Sure enough, off I did, and we caught barbel on terrestrial patterns on the margins. But we also started to see carp. And although I'd seen carp before and tried to fish for them in the UK when I was a kid, I really hadn't regarded them as a target for the fly rod. And this comes back to, once again, a little bit of inspiration. I picked up Lefty Cray's Fly Fishing in Salt Water. Crikey, it must be over 20 years ago now. And it was a revelation. It was like, oh, wow, you can use fly fishing for something different. It's not just trout and salmon. And obviously then ally that with having then tried it for saltwater fish, for pike, then barbel, seeing the carp and going, you know what, I can do this. It shouldn't be any different. The same skills apply. I became aware of the American scene. So the obvious one would be Barry Reynolds writing articles, Carp on the Fly as a book, seminal book there, and realizing that these guys are doing it in exactly the same way as trout fishers fish. It's based on observation, knowledge of the species. It just never occurred to me to use bait. Now, I don't have an issue with it, as such. One thing I do think is that, well, you wouldn't do it for trout, and it would undoubtedly work very well. So why do it? But as I say, I don't have a problem with it. It's that if people want to do it, it's their choice. If they're happy with that, it's fine by me. Steve Yeomans from Midlands Fly Fishing, way back in 2000, very early internet article, this one, by the way, from the UK. He said, fly rodding for carp is not the same as fly fishing for carp. And I generally go along with this. Dom Garnett has quite a good take on it. He says he regards it as a gateway drug, a way of bringing people into the sport. And I kind of like that as well. If it works, why not? It's a bit like the bait ponds that you have attached to almost every trout fishery, so people can just come along and have a go. Why not? Gives them the sensation of, it gets them into the fish. It's a bit of a wow thing, particularly with kids, or in fact, even adults who've never had that opportunity before. But I don't accept that it's necessary. Well, we know full well it's not necessary. And it's not also necessarily the best or most productive way. That depends on the situation on the day. So it's just having an open mind to it. Looking at it from the other side once again, because it's always the bait community who seem to be, or people coming from the bait community, seem to be the most vociferous about all you need to chum carp, particularly. But I actually see it as a potential barrier to the carp-curious fly fisher, which seems to be a little bit forgotten. If you're coming from a traditional fly fishing background, if you feel that bait is a necessary or an accepted approach, it can cause you to shy away from the idea a bit, from the species, rather, and maybe view it as a bit of a comedy sideshow, which isn't true. They're a game fish in their own right. So there are both sides to it, and I don't have an issue with it. Strangely, though, once again, we're in a very different ballpark to almost the rest of the world. Were we a non-UK based magazine, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It just doesn't pop up. I mean, if we look at our Carp Champions group on Facebook, something like 80% of the members are from overseas. Chumming isn't mentioned, because these guys aren't finding it necessary to do it. But to return to your original question, it's a valid approach. If people are having fun doing it, that's fine, and good on them if it brings people into the sport.
It's really interesting. There's a couple of things I've been thinking about, and I bought the Barry Reynolds and Brad Beefus book when it came out and read it, and I really enjoyed it. But I kind of put it down and put it away for a bit. That I thought, well, how can I apply that? Because, where I'd been catching carp, the water was incredibly muddy. And I thought, well, how are they going to see this? How's this going to work? How's that going to work? And I know we're going to get onto that at some stage. And I wonder as well with the chumming thing, do you think that is because some people it's a filler when we can't fish for trout, if it's too hot, if a trout fishery is shut down, whatever that may be. But what I hope to get now in the next thing, or the next segment, is a sense of, right, okay, as you rightly say, it's a technique that you love using, that you love to do. How do we go about doing that? What advice can you give us? How can I learn? Do I have to think about that venue with a little bit more clarity in the water? How do I think about approaching fish? How do I find the fish? They're the things I'm really interested, because this to me is something that I'd like to learn more about. And I've caught plenty of carp on the fly, but as a carp curious angler, I think, having spoken to you now, I want to get into this a little bit more and learn how to do it the way that you're doing it, for the reasons that you say as well, that it can be something I can go do if there's no water for trout in the river or salmon. That's what I can do. So where should I start? What should I be doing, and what should I be thinking about?
Okay, that's big subject actually, and I'm going to use an example just for starters. My key point is watch the fish. Try and find and observe fish. And my example for that, it was a revelation when I was out in Spain. I happened to see a load of bait fish, obviously troubled, leaping away out of the water, and naturally assumed it was what we'd regard as a conventional predator, a pike or whatever, possibly zander. And I was looking down into quite deep water, and what I saw absolutely astounded me. It was a small school of bait fish surrounded by a pod of maybe half a dozen quite sizable carp. They'd got them corralled, and they were piling in and battering into these bait fish. They were obviously hunting them down. The speed and the agility of these big fish was astounding. And carp are predatory. All fish are predatory in the right situation, and carp are astoundingly good predators. And it's quite something to see. Trying to persuade people that they don't just eat biscuits and prepared food is a big step in the UK, sadly. But with that mindset of you're going to go out and have a look and watch, it's going to be difficult if the water isn't particularly clear. But then you can use searching techniques such as you would do on any normal trout fishery. Quite a few of these aren't gin clear waters. And also just look for signs of fish is a good start. The most exciting, other than a pair of lips clooping on the surface and taking beetles and terrestrials and these sorts of things, is maybe to see the swirl of a tail. And, to see a tail poking, or the tip of a tail poking out of the water, that means carp head down feeding. Wonderful. You've cracked two of the bits here. The fact that you've got to find the carp in the first place. Well done. You've just done that. And two, is it feeding? Oh, yes, it is. Now, what's it going to be feeding on? You have to use a degree of imagination here. But once again, you could kick sample if you wanted to in your local pond and see what's available there. But it's a good bet that they're rummaging around for the same sorts of things that trout do. Various invertebrates, aquatic nymphs, that sort of thing. And we've got some specialized flies that do that. The various headstander type ideas, so they're weighted. You've got the hook point rides upwards. They're all derivatives, pretty much, of American saltwater patterns, bonefish patterns, particularly gotchas, crazy charlies, the fantastic clouds of minnow, which will catch almost anything that swims, quite honestly. And so it's getting the fly then in front of that fish. But there are the things to do to watch for the movements of the fish. And then you're going to have to be working out how you're going to get a fly in front of them and what you're going to do with that fly. No guarantees. I seem to recall you telling me that one of your first carp on a fly was a cruiser, and you flicked a fly into its path. It diverted, took the fly. Fantastic. To be honest, you did really well there, because carp cruising tend to be on a bit of a mission, and they're not necessarily feeding, but you obviously did exactly the right thing. I wouldn't have been able to resist that temptation either, so it's thinking on your feet a wee bit, but once you've got that carp feeding, or you can see the carp feeding, then it's a case of, right, what am I going to present to it? Tailing, get a weighted nymph in there, try and work out the direction the fish is going. If you can see the tail continue to move, that gives you an indication as to which way the fish is facing. You might see clouds of silt coming up. And quite often what's happening there is that the fish are burrowing through the silt, quite often looking for small shellfish, small crustaceans, that sort of thing. But once again, you can see which direction that cloud of silt is moving. And you need to try and lead the fish. If you drop something on its nose, the chances are you will spook it. And particularly if you run a line across its back, same as any fish, to be honest. But carp have got surprisingly good eyesight as well as other senses. And the chances are if you drop a big bushy nymph about a foot or so in front of where you estimate the fish will be, hopefully you'll see the line tighten, and then that's when your other troubles begin. That's if you can't see the fish properly.
Yeah. Really interesting. There's a few things I'm thinking about while you're saying this. I guess patience plays a big part in things, that you've got to be patient. Whereas, it is easy to chuck biscuits out and get them going. You've got to be patient. I guess it involves, we're in effect stalking the fish. So covering water, wandering around looking for signs of fish. The next thing is distance. I've seen that fish feeding. How far do I need to cast? Does it have to be a long cast? Can I get relatively close? And then those patterns, you mentioned a bushy nymph. Would something like a damselfly or a shrimp or those sorts of patterns that we'd use on still waters, would they be appropriate to use?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take the distance thing. Bushcraft is very, very important as far as carp are concerned. They've got incredible eyesight and they can spot you from a long way off, even when they're in quite murky water. So sometimes being able to chuck out a long cast is useful. What's better is to work on your bushcraft skills and try and get closer. And quite often, if you do that, you'll be able to get within a couple of rod's lengths of them, which is ideal, and gives you a much better chance of a proper presentation, and also the hookup, which we'll come to later. You mentioned the flies. So weighted fly patterns, exactly as you've suggested. The big proviso with carp is hooks. They really need to be heavy gauge hooks. Fine wire hooks, you might get away with it, but the chances are that initial run of the carp immediately after the take, straighten a hook. So 2x hooks, definitely heavy gauge wire hooks are required. But your standard nymph and damsel patterns. Woolly bugger is an absolutely superb all-round pattern. Size-wise, I would say anything between a 4 and a 12. I tend to be more on the bigger side. I'm generally targeting bigger fish, although even small carp can easily hit a size 4 hook. But once again, carp aren't daft. They know what their prey looks like. So you're not going to be tying an ant pattern on a size 4 hook. It's just completely unrealistic. You might strike lucky, you never know your luck. But your best bet then is you're looking at 12s and 14s. Once again, it's just thinking about it, looking and seeing what they're eating as best you can.
And the thing that you mentioned as well, there's a couple of things more that you said leading the fish. How far in front are you looking to land that fly? And also, if it's a weighted fly, I know you mentioned bonefish patterns that will sit the other way up, because I'd be thinking if I was leading the fish, my worry would be that I'm going to snag on the bottom. And is that where those bonefish patterns, or reversing the eyes round, would that make that less of an issue?
Absolutely. So that's pretty much the point of them, is that they can be scuffed along the bottom. It works really, really well, actually. And quite often they'll puff up little clouds of silt. As far as distance in front is concerned, that does depend a bit on the clarity of the water. The clearer the water, the further away you can get away with your cast. You can, there's a fabulous video online, it's a guideline video, I think, where you can see a guy called Javier Pena drop quite a big bushy pattern into clear water. You would have sworn that it was way far away from the fish. It must be a good 2 yards that he's dropped it in. You see the fish bristle, come alive, home in and dive on that thing like a cat. It's wildly exciting. So in clear water, you can lead them a wee bit more. And arguably, that then has less chance of spooking them. When you've got cloudy, silty water where obviously visibility isn't so great, you're going to need to get it a little bit closer to that fish. But rest assured, they will still see it and sense it. Which
Fantastic.
Leads us quite nicely to two presentations here. So we're talking about underwater. Underwater, you might be lucky and they'll take on the drop. That sometimes happens, but definitely you can be looking at retrieving there. And the retrieves are short, jerky, like a little insect. If you're looking at terrestrial patterns on the surface, then it's much better to work out where that fish is heading for and to leave it lying static. A drowning insect does not twitch across the surface of the water, certainly not in sort of 6-inch to 1 foot strips. So you have to think about that a bit and make you have to think like a fish, think like the organism a wee bit.
Yeah. So let's imagine I walked around, I found a feeding fish. It may be tailing, it may, you've spotted it. I've made my cast, I've made my little short retrieve, and the fish has eaten it. What next? Do I set on it? Do I strip strike? How do I, and on the drop, is it like a trout that it's quite clear that the fish has taken on the drop? How am I going to set on that fish?
Okay, so it's often very clear that the fish has taken. If it's on the drop, you will see the line move. But the big problem with carp is they are phenomenally good at ejecting something that doesn't feel right. And in fact, part of their feeding mechanism is to sort of suck and blow a wee bit as well. So timing that hit is absolutely vital. You will whisk a lot of flies out of carp's mouths when you start, and even as you get more proficient. But the strike, a trout strike is too slow. It just won't work properly. A standard lift of a rod, you'll be very, very lucky if you actually connect. But the flip side is the strip strike, which everybody talks about. But that, once again, just doesn't have the angle sometimes. And there's a couple of things on YouTube where you see guys actually doing this. They've got the rod pointed directly at the fish, the strip strike, and miss. It's a combination of the two, actually. So it's the lift and the strip. The lift gives you the angle. The strip sets that hook. What you've then got to be prepared for, and I almost guarantee the first time anybody who tries this hooks a carp will get bust off. I almost guarantee it, unless they're incredibly lucky, because that is when the fish goes. That initial power surge is off the scale. I've had experienced salmon fishermen say, do you know what? This is in a different league to salmon. Those fish hit, or after hit isn't really the word. There's momentary pause. It's so difficult to describe. And then they take off and they go route one. There is no deviation. There's no zigzagging and jagging about. It's route one, off like a steam train. And you have to be geared up to both physically, mentally, and arguably with your tackle to be able to absorb that shock. So I found out I was beginning to get snapped off quite a lot. I'd gone down that arms race thing of, hey, wow, I want to be a super caster and super fast rods and tip action. Yeah, it's all really cool. And I can cast to the other side of the pond. But I found that wasn't giving me the shock absorption that I needed to protect the tippet from these big fish. And we're talking big tippets as well, by the way. Just to drop on that, I don't use anything less than 12 pound, no matter how small the carp are. I've had fish that wouldn't have gone 3 or 4 pound conclusively bust off a 12 pound tippet. So do bear that in mind. When I'm targeting the really big fish, quite often I'm up to 18 pound tippet. And it's generally about 6 to 10 feet of tippet material straight through literally to the loop on the end of the fly line. Although a lot of the time, particularly when I'm using terrestrials, I will use a furled leader and then step down to the tippet. So that was just a little bit of an aside. But coming back to the shock absorption, softer action rods tend to work a wee bit better. The new S-glass is fantastic material for this. It's got the power and the stiffness that you'd expect to be able to do quite fast casts, but it's got the flexibility and the resilience to be able to fight that fish right from the butt. It's a very advanced material, and it's way, way different to the old e-glass. I know there's still a lot of people think, oh, it's just glass rebranded. It isn't. It's a very different material, and it's worth trying. It's a very, very nice feel. The other thing that I'm a bit of a stickler about is drags on reels. These have to be silky, silky smooth. Now, I know, from an intro point of view, it probably won't matter what you use. But eventually, if you get into it, you'll realize that you need that whole system to be nice and smooth. And so really do look for a very good quality drag and a fair amount of capacity. If you've only got 100 meters of backing on your reel, you're going to be seeing that spool fairly regularly. So bear that in mind. Wow. I think at some point, though, we maybe should just talk about beginner setups as well.
Yeah, absolutely. let's go on to that. One of the other things I just want, while you were talking about tackle, I assume a large percentage of the time you're going to be using a floating fly line. And I guess what line weights are you using is it sort of 6, 7, 8 weights?
Right. So if we try and cover both the bases of what most fly fishers will have in their quiver, so to speak, most fly fishers will have a 6, 7, 8 rod and the gear to go with it, and that's absolutely ideal. For the bigger carp, then an 8 weight would be the ideal. 8 weight for me seems to be a good all-round rod for be it saltwater, big carp, reservoirs, whatever. But 6, 7, 8 ideal. Pretty much your standard big water gear is perfect to start with. There are a lot of people out there catching fairly reasonable sized carp on sort of 3 and 4 weights and amazingly low breaking strain tippets. Fair play to them. It's quite a display of angling prowess, but I almost guarantee they're not getting those fish in very quickly, and it's not particularly fair on the fish. Big carp will make a mess of you. There's no two ways around it. But yeah, your basic kit, 6, 7, 8 weight, floating line. Make sure you've got a reasonable amount of backing on your reel. Get out there, have some fun.
And what about for the beginners then? And I guess to add to that, mat and net as well are really important.
Certainly you certainly need a net. You're going to struggle to bring these things in by hand, and it's a lot fairer on the fish. And if we're talking from a UK perspective and being one of the fisheries, then having fish handling is something that actually fly fishers can learn an awful lot from the bait community here. They treat them almost like babies, but actually it's quite nice to see. And so having a mat so you're protecting the fish from the ground, that's important as well. So do be aware that the fisheries will have rules about fish handling, and they make a great deal of sense. Further afield, trying to find something, some way of protecting the fish is important, and carrying around a big unhooking mat is sometimes quite impractical. My take on that: unhook the fish in the water. Sorry, the fish is far more important than your grip and grin shot. Unhook the fish in the water. It's as simple as that, really. You're looking after the fish, number one. But certainly, if you are removing the fish from the environment for any period of time at all, make sure it's protected from dropping. You don't want to be dropping it on a hard surface, and you don't want to be, or any surface, and you don't want to be laying it on the ground either. Maybe a sheet of polythene, maybe your fly fishing jacket, if you really must have that trophy shot, but ideally do it in the water.
Perfect. And you mentioned about beginners as well, and kit for beginners. What were you going to say about that?
Well, as I said, if you're coming from a fly fishing background, the chances are that you've got this 6, 7, 8 reservoir type setup in your bag. If you're not into fly fishing, that would pretty much be, if you were to speak to a buddy, it'd be pretty much the kit that they tell you to get started out with anyway. So that's great. Number 2, really, after getting your kit, is try and find a buddy. Try and find a buddy who does it, whether that's just a fly fishing buddy or somebody who's into carp or whatever. Try and tag along. Worldwide, there are actually a number of very, very experienced carp fly fishing guides. In the UK, there's less so. But certainly that would be a good way forward. People like, and I'm going to miss lots of people here, I know, but there aren't that many, but people like Dom Garnett, who we mentioned before, Nick Hart, both of these guys guide for carp, and we'll show you both ways of doing it, give you a great day out as well. Chris Kent ran an introductory weekend through Orvis last year, And although it concentrated on the baited approach, it was a fantastic way for people to get into the sport. It wasn't particularly expensive. It was an awful lot of fun. And we need to be encouraging these sorts of things. It's great that was Orvis, incidentally. Orvis have actually been quite proactive on the carp fly fishing side. And that leads me quite nicely into the ideal book for anybody who's interested in fly fishing for carp, which is by Kirk Dieter, and it's called The Orvis Guide to Fly Fishing for Carp, strangely enough. And I would recommend anybody who's interested in fly fishing for carp gets that book. It covers pretty much the lot: the habits of the fish, tactics, tackle, flies. So definitely well worth a read, and it's not ridiculously expensive.
Fascinating. Great. A couple of more questions, because you're really inspiring me, Dave. One of them, you mentioned about the fish that I caught was traveling through and I casted it. And that was 2-3 years ago, actually. I'd caught a number. I've been doing it, and I'd worked, as you know, with Nick, and we'd been playing around with it a little bit then. And I'd sort of left it for a bit. And that was in November, I think it was. It was either October or November, and I could see the fish and cast at it. There's a couple of things I'd love to ask. This time of year, is there a time of the day that's you're specifically looking, or will you just go fishing? And is there times of year, can you catch fish on these methods all year round?
Okay, so time of day, in some respects, carp are the ultimate lazy man's fish, in that you don't have to get out of bed too early. They like a bit of warmth. Although they'll feed all day long, certainly in terms of if you want to see them up on the surface, the chances are that, bright sunlight, nice warm conditions, that'll be the ideal to get them moving. But as with all fish, they seem to be quite active at dawn and also at dusk. But my take on it would be make life easy on yourself. Midday onwards with the sun up, fantastic, and you should enjoy good sport there. So during the day, ideal. Time of year. Once again, carp have generally been regarded as a bit of a summer fish, but the more carp fishing has been done and analysed, and particularly with the fly fishing side of things, the more people are finding that actually, they will feed all year round. It's once again applying those skills of observation and experimentation. So we've seen some fantastic catches of carp from almost icebound ponds and rivers in the States on the fly. They're a little bit slower in terms of their activity, but they will feed, and they will feed on naturals, and that's what they're doing all year round anyway. Once again, just to touch on the naturals point of or side of things, we haven't really mentioned going back to my experience with the bait fish. So bait fish patterns can be highly productive if they're homed in on fry. And a good example of this, and it's really in some ways quite humorous, is that a lot of the carp fisheries will now actually net out and try and remove these small bait fish from the carp fisheries, because the carp home in on the fish rather than the boilers. And so the bait anglers are complaining they're not catching anything. And the fish are going, hey, wow, look at this. I suppose in some respects, it's the difference between us being served up a lovely piece of sea bass and a corn burger. Which would you rather go for? And I know, there are people who will say, well, I'd rather the corn burger, but I'm sure you get the argument here. So once again, try and think it's not outside the box, but try and think a little bit like that fish. If you see them chasing fry, whack on a fry pattern, please. It's how I caught one of my first bigger carp.
And I guess there's so much in here, Dave, that's inspiring, and it's inspired me, and I hope it inspires our listeners too. I guess one of the key things with this as well is if you're going to go this route, leave the dog biscuits at home and the bread at home, isn't it?
Yes, generally, I would go for that. But then, it's horses for courses. If people want to do that, why not? If it's fun and if they see that that's what catches them fish, I really don't have an issue with it. And, it's a free world out there. I just think that certainly from a personal perspective, I find it, one, more satisfying, and two, well, I've never actually done it. But I certainly find it very productive doing what I do. An example of that would be one of my trips last year where I caught, I forget what the numbers of fish were, but in the space of a week, you could say, oh, well, you only caught, I think I caught 8 or maybe 10 fish during the course of that week. But the smallest was 8 kilograms. Think about that for a moment. That was the smallest. The biggest was just shy of 16 kilos.
Wow.
Yeah. And on one amazing day, I actually had 3 fish up around the sort of 14, 15 kilo mark. None of this was chummed. All of it was sight fished. And as a very well-respected carp angler said to me, you know what? Most bait anglers would be proud and maybe even jealous of that hit rate. So it just shows that it can be done. I would say, because in the UK particularly, we're quite fortunate in some respects. There is the stocked fishery culture as far as carp are concerned. If you want to try catching carp on a fly, maybe use the bait approach. The chances are you're not going to be able to wander around that fishery the same way that you do a trout fishery. So you may not be able to go and look for those fish. If that's the case, by all means, get yourself some dog biscuits and give it a go. And hopefully you'll catch carp. And hopefully you'll think, oh, I can maybe now start targeting carp elsewhere. It's fun. It's exciting. It's a real buzz.
Really interesting. I guess coming from my own standpoint, somebody who's fished a little bit, that I would like to be able to, having caught bonefish and stuff like that, that's where this suddenly now for me has given me the confidence, and I'm going to get my Barry Reynolds book out in a minute and have another read of it. And that's where it's given me the confidence to say, actually, I'm going to do that. And where before, I've got a carp lake down the 3 minutes away that I'd caught plenty on dog biscuit techniques, whereas now it's making me think it is a quite cloudy water. That's the only thing. And my initial thoughts while we're doing this is, I wonder if I need to research a little bit more, find something with a little bit more clarity that gives me the confidence to say, right, okay, yeah, I can pop down the road there and give it a go and see what happens. But it's really inspired me to look at it in a different way. And I hope it does the same with the listeners as well. So thank you for that. Also, you say you travel as well for carp. Is there a favourite destination aside from the UK?
I love central Spain. It's out the back of beyond. I love the whole... I love the distance. I love the wild side of this, integrating with the local people. English isn't widely spoken out there. I don't mind having a go at speaking Spanish, and it certainly helps you on the ground. You're not sort of like a group of English guys out on the lash abroad. You're one guy, a little bit humble, and you tend to be more accepted by people like that. And you find things out. One of those early articles that I did for you described my experiences of finding this pokey little bar in the back of nowhere. And it turned out that the owner of the bar was actually a highly experienced carp and barbel fly fisherman. And, you're not going to find that sort of thing by being in a big group and sticking to yourself. So I actually really like the idea of just one or two people integrating a little bit, local food, local culture, and doing some exploration. So for me, that's a biggie. I love Gran Canaria. Gran Canaria is very much it's a whole continent on an island. It's absolutely fantastic. If you want sun, sea, and sangria, you've got it down on the south side. You want mountains, they're there in the middle. And the big thing for me is there are whopping carp. I mean, absolutely monstrous carp in the reservoirs up there, and they're a real challenge. And I love it. It's really, really exciting. Once again, it's relatively remote. You've got to earn your turns, to use skiers' terminology. You've got to be prepared to walk and stalk, get sore knees, get sunburned, run out of water a wee bit maybe, and quite often blank or maybe muff the shot. But the rewards are evident, with the catches when you do hit on it. So for me, travel is a big thing. Also, I have to say, because we didn't mention this, but I currently live in just outside Granton-on-Spey, which is north of the Cairngorms in the Scottish Highlands. We're not blessed with carp waters, so it's actually, believe it or not, it's easier and certainly a bit cheaper for me to drive down to Edinburgh and hop on a plane to somewhere on the continent, and I get the weather as well. So travel is a big thing for me, and I just absolutely love it. Some of it's not even about the fishing. It's much more about the environment, the nature, and a different culture, and a sense of place. Just love it.
Lovely. Do you have a dream destination, the one that you would love to go visit, to say, right, this is where I'd like to chase something?
I think we'd all like to do the sort of tropical atoll stuff or blue water stuff. Who wouldn't want to go to India and fish for marsia, for instance? Who wouldn't want to trek around Australia and maybe look at Murray cod and barramundi? All of these are just, you'd love to go. There are probably two places that stick in my mind. Recently, I've been doing a bit of research into Iran, which is definitely off the tourist track. But there are massive barbel out there. I had a buddy from Iran when I was at university, got on with him so well. The culture, the people seem really, really nice. I'm sure that goes for every country in the planet, to be honest. But I quite like their food. So that's one massive barbel on the fly out in Iran. And then another one, coming back to the very, very early years, inspired by Gerald Durrell and David Attenborough, and more latterly, Jeremy Wade, for instance, is Arapaima. I read about Arapaima when I was a kid. When I got into fishing, I always had thoughts of, I'd like to go to Guyana and get up the Rupununi and look for these massive fish in the wild. And I still would. I mean, I know you can fly to Thailand now and there are ponds with them stocked. But for me, that doesn't have the same cachet. I'd like to get out there in the forests in Southern America and hunt really big Arapaima on the fly. That would just be nuts to me. How much fun would that be?
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Now, we've been speaking for nearly an hour and a half.
Crikey.
And I would love to keep on talking, but I try and keep them around an hour and a half or so. There's been so much information in here. You've genuinely inspired me, who's somebody who's been around the block a little bit, to say, right, okay, I'm going to give this a go. And I'm already planning a trip in my mind. of something I want to do. So watch our channels closely to see if I manage to put it off. We've had a little bit of rain, so I'm hoping I might get swings and flies. But this has really inspired me to look at something that's been on trend for a little while now, but to approach it in a different way. And that, along with how I love to do things, the slightly less obvious route to me is always the more interesting one. And actually stalking down a fish is something that I'm really, really excited to try and do. So Dave, thank you so much for that. I think our listeners will find this fascinating too. You mentioned your Facebook page, Carp Champions. Can you tell us a little bit where we can find that and more information about that, should people want to join those sorts of communities?
Sure. So Carp Champions was set up by me to try and bring together carp on fly and lure, funnily enough, anglers from across the world. And we've pretty much done that. It's very accessible. It's a public group. So if you just go into Facebook, do a search for Carp Champions, will pop up. And what you'll find on there is we're just around 1,000 members, which doesn't sound very much, but it's the quality of those members. We've got the leading exponents of fly fishing for carp from around the world on there, the likes of Dan Frazier, Jim Pankiewicz, who was a highly innovative fly tire. He's done a series of instructional videos. They're on there. All of these people are out there wanting to help you. And I think that's a key point, approach it with an open mind, ask what might feel like a daft question. You won't get sneered at or abused or laughed at. People will help you and will generally try and help you along the journey. You'll probably make some new friends out of it. It might inspire you to travel a wee bit, but most importantly, the information's there. I'm ably assisted by Jamie Sanford and Jeff Hadley, both of whom have got plenty of experience. We'd love to see you there, quite honestly. So come along and have a look, ask the questions. As soon as you're on there, you'll know how to get in touch with me. I'm quite happy for people to send me private messages. I'm more than happy to give my time and what experience I've got. So please, get in touch.
Dave, thank you so much for that. Thank you for being such a great guest.
Pete, thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to hook up and chat. And it's been an honor and a privilege. And I really hope that people, as you say, are inspired by this and get out there and look for some different species, try some different methods of fishing, and basically enjoy that adventure. That's what it's all about.
Fantastic. That's a lovely way to end. Thank you, Dave, very much indeed. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. There are plenty more planned. Always contact me if you need help, advice, if you have questions, if there's things you've liked, if there's things you haven't liked. I'm always happy to talk to you about those as well. But thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. Plenty more planned for very, very soon.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.